Marketing Communications at the Massachusetts Public Health Association. And I'm very pleased to be here today with a number of my colleagues to present on the Complete Street Certification Program, a program designed to incentivize complete streets on local roads. I'm particularly excited to be talking about this subject as my organization and many of my colleagues from the advocacy community and organizations statewide and local across the Commonwealth have worked for the last 2 years to help create this program to accomplish goals around complete streets and healthy transportation and economic development in our communities. And we're very pleased that the legislature did in fact include the creation of this program in the Transportation Bond Bill passed last year. And we're very pleased today to be able to provide a summary of that legislation as well as recommendations from the advocacy community on the implementation of this program. And we're further particularly pleased to have heard announced recently from MassDOT officials that $20 million over 4 years is in fact going to be programmed in the MassDOT capital budget to support the program. We think this is going to have tremendous effect on our municipalities. Complete streets, of course, are designed to be sure that pedestrians, cyclists, and transit users are fully accommodated by our state's roadway systems, and in this case in particular on our local roadways. This presentation is going to cover these 5 areas. We're going to talk briefly about why we believe this program is so important, who some of the program supporters are. We'll provide a brief summary of what was in the statute. We will then talk about some recommendations for the successful implementation, and finally provide some community illustrations. Today's presentation is not designed to provide an overview of what complete streets are or what the benefits are. We're assuming the audience for this presentation is to some degree educated about those topics. But we do have some resources that are provided at the end of the presentation for people who would like to learn more. These are today's presenters, myself again, and I'm also joined by Wendy Landman, who is the Executive Director of Walk Boston. I'm joined also by Michelle Sicolo, the Community Development Director for the Town of Hudson, and Julie Kelly, who is the Coordinator of Mass in Motion for the City of Fall River. So I'm going to talk briefly about 5 reasons we believe this program is so important. And the first is that it's designed to incentivize a complete streets approach on our local roadways. As many people know, a significant majority, about 77% of our roadways are controlled by local municipalities, and our very forward-thinking and nationally recognized state policies, such as the Highway Design Guide, do not directly apply to those local roadways. And this program is a way to provide support and an incentive to municipalities to incorporate complete streets element into their roadways, including an incentive to allocate Chapter 90 funds toward complete streets. Secondly, we know from years of experience that relatively small awards to municipalities can make a significant impact, both on planning as well as design and infrastructure. The design and the planning support are critical to advance complete streets. In addition, on the infrastructure side, there's a number of ways that capital funding could advance complete streets in municipalities, even with relatively small awards, including adding incrementally toward a pot of funds that includes Chapter 90 funds to incorporate complete streets into a broader project, or to specifically support improvements like ramps, curb cuts, or crosswalks that in and of themselves are relatively inexpensive. Third, we know, and we heard during the legislative conversation about this, how much municipal leaders want to advance complete streets already. Many of them are working hard with their city and town employees and advocates in their communities, and see it as a way to improve quality of life and economic development in their communities. Fourth, we believe this is a powerful tool to advance existing goals that MassDOT has already stated, including goals related to mode share, to greenhouse gas reduction, and healthy transportation. And last, we believe this program is a terrific way to continue MassDOT's national leadership and Massachusetts' national leadership on healthy and active transportation, which is recognized all across the country. This program has been supported by a large number of advocacy and nonprofit organizations, both statewide and local, some of which you see here, and these logos are not exhaustive. Groups as diverse as Transportation for Massachusetts, public health organizations like ours, as well as the American Cancer Society, and local groups such as Fun in Pittsburgh and Voices for a Healthy South Coast, just to give a few examples. The program has also strongly been supported by municipal officials, and there's 2 slides here that list a number of mayors, town managers, city councilors, and other municipal officials who have actively supported this program. This list, I think, is particularly notable for the diversity of kinds of communities that you'll see: small towns, suburban communities, urban centers, from all regions of the state. You'll see wealthy communities and low-income communities. Every type of community in our state is represented here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy Landman to provide a brief summary of the legislation.
Thanks, Maddie. So I wanted to start by mentioning that this legislation was initially proposed by the advocacy organizations as a separate piece of legislation, and we were especially pleased when the administration incorporated it into the Transportation Bond Bill of 2014, and moved it through that process to include it in the legislation for the state. So you'll see here that it was Chapter 79 of the Act of 2014, and it created the Complete Street Certification Program as a Mass General Law. The authorization for the bill included 2 key components. The first is that it allows and directs the program to include both infrastructure and planning money for municipalities. And the second is that 1/3 of the grants are directed to be awarded to communities that have a median household income below the average of the Commonwealth, and that's a very important piece of the legislation because in many cases it's those lower income communities where a greater proportion of the population is dependent on walking and transit and bicycling, and those are some of the communities that have had the hardest time spending funds on complete streets. As part of the program, there's a requirement that municipalities become certified in their approach to making their streets complete. And that's the piece of the program that MassDOT is working on right now. As you see here, complete streets are defined as streets that provide accommodation for users of all transportation modes. There are a series of requirements for communities to be certified under the program, and these range from policies and the adoption of certain policies to things like incorporating policies into the practice of the community for routine road work. And that's very important because many of the changes that happen on streets in local communities really are part of a routine maintenance and operations for the communities. So it's important to note that the Complete Streets program here is not directed just to complete rebuilds of community streets, but rather to be incorporated into day-to-day activities. And another important piece of this is using the Complete Streets program to work towards the mode share goal set by MassDOT of tripling the number of walking, biking, and transit trips across the state over the next 20 years. And the way that municipalities are going to be asked to address that, Michelle is going to address that a bit later in the presentation. As part of the legislation, the MassDOT was directed to set up an advisory committee to oversee the program, and you can see on the slide what was called out in the legislation. In fact, as MassDOT is proceeding with the program right now, they're signaling their intent to use one of the existing advisory bodies to oversee the program, and we in the advocacy community think that that's a reasonable way to proceed because there are a number of standing bodies that incorporate the folks that are listed here in their membership, and we think that setting up an additional committee isn't necessarily needed. So that's something that's in progress right now. Finally, there are requirements both for the municipalities and for MassDOT as it regards getting the program underway, and MassDOT is required to file a legislative report annually by April 1st of each year. With that, I'm going to turn to Michelle to talk about our suggestions for implementation of the program.
Thank you, Wendy. This is Michelle Socolo. I'm the Community Development Director for the Town of Hudson, as was mentioned earlier. I'm also a member of the Healthy Transportation Compact Advisory Council and a member of the Green Dot Advisory Committee. And I've been working with all of my peers and colleagues in the advocacy groups to talk about this legislation and brainstorm ways that the program might unfold to support the goals of the legislation. It's important to note that at this stage, the ball is really in MassDOT's hands as MassDOT develops the program itself, but we do have some ideas of how things could work efficiently and maximize our objectives. So there are 5 criteria that Wendy mentioned that the legislation explicitly identifies, and we think this criteria was intentionally left broad to allow for flexibility for MassDOT. What's most important about the broad nature of the legislation is that we believe all municipalities should be able to participate in the program regardless of their size, whether they're rural or they're urban or suburban, whether they're wealthy or whether they're low-income communities. We want and encourage MassDOT to develop a program that will really incentivize all citizen towns. Complete streets are available and within reach for every type of community. So criteria 1, the complete streets policy, it says in the legislation it can be a bylaw or an administrative policy, and that's an important distinction because many towns have told us they're not ready to do a bylaw or an ordinance, but they want to move forward. So policies could be promulgated and adopted by a mayor, by a board of selectmen, by a city council, as a resolution, just as an initial policy, even by a standard operating procedure by a DPW, for instance. So that we start off with a policy and then potentially it gets progressively more permanent as the community moves toward an ordinance or toward a bylaw. But we do think MassDOT should allow for flexibility in the early stages of this program to get more communities to participate. The other elements of the policy itself is that the municipality should clearly express a commitment to moving forward and incorporating complete streets in their own activities. So that statement should be in the policy. And we should also make sure that we recognize that the policy should allow communities who are already doing complete streets some flexibility. There are communities, for instance, like Cambridge, like Lexington, even like Hudson, that do many good works in the complete streets arena, but don't necessarily have precise policies. Perhaps they have guidelines or manuals that they've developed that are very, very detailed, but they may not have a specific form of a policy. So we encourage MassDOT to allow for flexibility in the type of policy. The second criterion, coordinating with MassDOT, identifies and recognizes that right now there's a lot of data out there in asset management that MassDOT is collecting, as well as in the communities that have things like pavement management data. But it's not very clear yet that everyone has a full picture of all of the on-the-ground improvements that exist today. So this step of coordinating with MassDOT to try to identify and understand what existing features are in place is an important starting point, so we know to the best of our ability what's on the ground. An early meeting, a conversation, perhaps including the RPAs as well in this first step to mapping and identifying where sidewalks are, where bike lanes might exist, where ADA ramps are missing, for instance, is an important starting point for the program. Criterion 3, incorporating policy into routine maintenance work. We think this is where potentially the program can have the biggest impact and can be the most important because, as you all know, MassDOT through the Chapter 90 program to cities and towns allows cities and towns to do ongoing annual maintenance. Some towns also appropriate additional funds on their own, as well as do borrowing projects for capital improvements. And since 77% of the roads are under municipalities' control, if municipalities actively incorporate complete streets into their routine road work, this will have a tremendous long-term impact on the full development of complete streets. So we encourage the program to make sure that communities think comprehensively about all the maintenance work they do, not just repaving in the same old fashion they've always done it, but looking anew at any opportunity they have to incorporate complete streets. So, for instance, utility work isn't something you'd normally think of as a complete streets component, but whether that be making sure that the new lines are put in a way that doesn't obstruct sidewalks. New poles aren't in the middle of the sidewalk, and fire hydrants actually get put in a place that can allow an intersection to receive an ADA ramp. Those type of details get overlooked frequently because the person in charge of the utility work may not be also in charge of the road work. So coordinating at the local level into routine maintenance is important. Criterion 4, private development. All major reconstruction of existing properties by the private sector go through a permitting process at the local level, and cities and towns do have extensive regulations in place, such as their site plan regulations or their subdivision regulations, also their traffic rules and orders, that are opportunities for cities and towns to make sure that they are incorporating complete streets into new development. And it may also be necessary as part of this program or encouraged for cities and towns to modernize and update those regulations. So we want to make sure that when a developer comes in, we're also thinking about how to connect that new development to the shopping mall next door or that housing subdivision to the local school, for instance, and not missing those opportunities to coordinate to improve the complete streets access for all users. Criterion 5 is the municipal mode share goal. This complements MassDOT's existing mode shift goal, but it's slightly different that we're saying the legislation says we should make a goal for increasing mode share. So the number of users that are taking trips by transit, by pedestrian trips, by bicycle should increase as part of this program. But we know that collecting the data in the initial years is going to be difficult, and right now there's not a baseline of all trips taken in all municipalities. So here it's important to be realistic about what type of data can be collected and be flexible and make sure that communities are not scared by the idea that we need to increase the activity in these areas, but rather incentivized to make small incremental change. The funding structure and the uses of the funding is an important piece of the program, and we want to emphasize here that some communities are at a different stage of their understanding of complete streets and may need help with planning and policy development, and other communities may be ready to go and ready to do capital improvements. So again, we encourage flexibility in how the money is spent. We imagine that ideally MassDOT will develop sort of a two-step program. Well, first there'll be certain baseline things that communities need to meet to be certified, and then they'll move on to make applications on a regular basis for the actual money itself. But key here is the goal to leverage local spending, and just a reminder that 33% of the funding has to be awarded to municipalities with a median household income below the state's average.
Thank you, Michelle. Going to turn it over next to Julie Kelly, who is the coordinator of the Mass in Motion program for the city of Fall River, to talk about some community illustrations of how this program relates to what communities are already doing and how it could support complete streets in those communities. And I do want to stress that the communities listed in this section really are intended as illustrations of the kind of work going on in cities and towns across the Commonwealth, and are certainly not intended as recommendations for where we think funding should necessarily go, which of course should be decided through a competitive process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Maddie. It's great to be here. Fall River and many other communities across the Commonwealth are paying particular attention to making streets more livable for all. Pleasant Street in Fall River is a location where senior citizens were engaged in walkability audits, and where the Fall River Police Department are addressing the high number of accidents involving motorists, bicycles, and pedestrians. These audits and observations are only as good as the resources cities and towns can make available for improvements. This picture shows a newly painted crosswalk with keyboard striping, allowing residents of the elderly and disabled high-rise Cattell Heights to cross safely to the retail area of bakeries, post office, and barbershop. A small improvement previously neglected due to the lack of time, manpower, and money. many municipalities are ready and active in engaging in complete street development. Holyoke is on track with the City Council voting on a complete streets ordinance, and I know they've been working on bicycle infrastructure with Mass Bike, and same with Worcester, quite a bit of development along with their policy development for bicycle access and infrastructure. Lawrence has completed the Spigot River Greenway, and that connects through parks and through ball fields to retail areas right through the center of the city of Lawrence. These are great examples and places that will inspire the rest of us to look into complete streets as a way to grow community among our populations. The Complete Street certification funding can make an enormous difference in municipalities of all sizes. Here in these pictures, we see the improvements again in the crosswalks, but additional funds could allow curb cuts and ADA ramps for all to safely cross. These amenities are neglected as municipalities struggle to meet all the needs for upkeep and construction. Cities and towns are working against great constraints. To improve safety, this intersection needs far more than the crosswalks repainted. It will need planning, a design, and then funds for construction. Complete Streets funding can help make Chapter 90 monies go much further, both in terms of planning and design and in terms of the small additions that can make all the difference in making a street passable for all users. The South Coast Bikeway Alliance is a collaboration of 10 municipalities, similar to many such connectivity efforts across the state. The municipalities of Swansea through Wareham have been working for the last 5 years on safe off-road and on-road pathways that will link Rhode Island to Cape Cod. The smaller towns and rural areas that make up this route often struggle even more than cities to make the shift to complete streets. This is where it's so important to know that in this policy there is no one-size-fits-all. The policy is adaptable to the needs of each community. These particular small towns and rural areas need assistance with planning and design to get the ball rolling. They may need additional funding for construction. Complete Street certification funding will allow community leaders, both in and outside of government, to take an important step in making these dreams into realities. Thank you, Maddie.
Thank you very much, Julie, for your presentation. And I want to thank Wendy and Michelle also for being part of this presentation today. I want to thank the staff and officials at MassDOT who have been in close touch with us and in many conversations with us over the last year to talk about this program. We're very optimistic that the program is going to have a significant impact in local communities. And we hope that today's presentation and the slides will be helpful as we think about next steps in implementing the program. I did want to end with a couple quick slides. The slide here is just some additional resources for folks who would like to learn more from some national organizations, including the U.S. Department of Transportation, includes model policies and other guidance about complete streets, as well as some resources from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council here at home. And lastly, I wanted to provide the contact information for all of the presenters today, as well as for our colleagues at MAPC who have been really instrumental in this process. And any of us would be very happy to hear from you with questions or ideas or to continue the conversation from today. And with that, I'll say thank you once again, and we'll look forward to working together on this program.